So first of all, Jimmy Gwetch for having me and all the sponsors, and Deborah for and another Deborah for coordinating this. So and for coming out on or joining in on screen time on a Thursday evening as well. So I know everyone's lives are busy, so it's a thrill to have you want to join us today. So I happen to be in Toronto right now, and as Eric mentioned, I'm from Whitefish River First Nation, and these days I've been there a lot, but this week I'm in Toronto. So I like to think I'm an Anishinaabe person who lives and works in my own territory, so Great Lakes, Anishinaabe, and Whitefish River First Nation is around Manitoulin. So I consider myself very lucky. I'm going to share with you, I think it makes sense, but because there's so much happening with climate change. As you know, the COP meetings are coming up, the Conference of the Parties on Climate Change in Scotland. So there's been pretty well climate change, climate justice has been on my brain like 24/7, like every day. This is what I think about. And there's so many other aspects coming in as folks try to address this issue. So some of my remarks are going to be based on, I serve as a committee member on the Assembly of First Nations Environment and Climate Change Advisory Committee. I also am on the expert panel for adaptation for the Institute for Climate Choices. I'm also part of, just been recently appointed to the Health Adaptation Strategy. That's part of Canada's Healthy Environment, Healthy Economy Climate Change Plan. And I've also been involved in a number of assessments in the Canadian national context, but also for the IPCC. So that's all sort of brought me to thinking in certain ways and my experiences that I'll share with you. I've also engaged in community-based work and facilitated an elders youth gathering on traditional knowledge and climate change, and I'll draw on insights from that. So I'm trying to bring all these very different, what I call circles, into the narrative and information knowledge that I'll share with you today. So that's where a lot of it is coming from. So ironically, really, probably the insights that are most meaningful for me are in these other spaces where I'm with other people, I guess virtually for the last 2 years or so, and then trying to contribute to these broader processes. So I'm going to share a screen, and it worked 15 minutes ago, so hopefully it continues to work. And then I do, sorry, you just have to bear with me here. So one of the ways that I like to start my presentations is just always reminding people that Indigenous peoples have always been here. So on the territories, and I appreciate the territorial acknowledgement, is that Indigenous peoples we are a complete society. So this is the assumption that I start from. Indigenous people just aren't populations, but actually nations, complete societies, and as a result, have your own legal system, political systems, diplomatic traditions, and how you interact with other nations, our own knowledge systems. So we had our own systems of knowledge and ways of being that would enable appropriate and ethical and moral relationships with all of creation. And I guess the outcome of this is sustainable relations. Now, what I'll say about that is I don't want to ever leave the impression this was a romanticized state. It wasn't. It was intellectually and physically demanding. We made mistakes as Anishinaabe people. The difference was we could solve them on our terms. We could meet the challenges that we were facing on our terms. And due to colonialism, as I'll point out later in the presentation, we're not able to do that. And it's become a major constraint, even in particular to addressing climate change challenges felt in our communities. So I do want to, so I do like to point that out, that in my mind, a lot of climate change knowledge already exists within communities. It just really hasn't been mobilized in spaces to kind of have the influence that it could have. So I wanted to start off with a story. I like to work with stories, and this is one of my favorite ones. And this is a version. I'm going to say a very short version of it. It's nowhere going to do this story any justice, but this version um, is Edward Benton Binet, and he's since passed away, and his book, the Mishomish Book. So in the story, people are behaving very badly. Anishinaabe are given gifts in order to live well with each other and live well with the natural world, for lack of a better word, or all of creation, spirit worlds, ancestors, those yet to come, other beings, other persons. And so we were given gifts to do that, the pipe, the drum, tobacco to send messages. And so we were given these gifts in order to live well with the earth. And over time, Anishinaabe people started to disrespect those gifts and started to not treat each other well, not treat the natural world very well. And the creator was upset about that and called forth destruction was going to happen in 4 days. And the animals became very concerned because they loved the Anishinaabe, they loved future generations. And the eagle is nominated to go speak to the creator to petition on behalf of the people. So the eagle does, because the eagle can fly the highest, and asks the creator for more time and for the love of future generations, because they can learn how to live well with the earth again, that he would try to find people who are still living well with the earth, who know the traditions, who are following the protocols, who are respecting life. And the eagle has 4 days to do this, and flies and can hardly find anyone until the 4th day, sees a family who are still conducting the ceremonies, engaging in the traditions, and living well with the earth and respecting other life. So the eagle just makes it in time, and it's significant because in the story, the eagle flies up at the Dobbin, which is dawn. It's not night and it's not day, and that's a special time when sort of the time stands still, and is able to petition to the creator to successfully petition to the creator to not let forth destruction. And the eagle's job is to fly over the earth to find people who are still living well with the earth and respecting all life. So to me, I see this as a climate change story, and it'll make sense later on as I speak about this. Of course, with a lot of stories, you're gonna learn from them what you're ready to learn from them, and they're going to mean something different to different people. I don't think the story was told by my ancestors for thousands of years because, because climate change was going to come. There was other kinds of other lessons in the story. That's just how because my headspace is climate change at the moment, how I'm thinking about this story and how we can learn from it in developing and generating climate change knowledge and solutions. So living well and responsibility. So what do these look like? And this has become a major push internationally in terms of biodiversity, in terms of protecting wildlife and protected areas and climate change. And what we know on the planet, and I find this extremely interesting because most people don't think of, let's say, language retention, Indigenous language retention, and revitalization as an important climate change strategy. So that's often not part of normal climate change discourse. But and this is it's international research and an interesting study that came out of the University of British Columbia as well recently. As well, Indigenous peoples make up only 5% of the world's population. They speak majority of its 7,000 languages and own, occupy, or use resources on some 22% of the global land area, which in turn harbors 80% of the world's biological diversity. So Indigenous peoples are the caretakers of most of the planet's biodiversity. This is also true in Canada. Most species at risk is found in First Nation communities. Not too far from where you are, and Walpole Island has the highest number of species at risk. So as they're disappearing everywhere else, they continue to thrive in First Nation lands under First Nations caretaking. And the places where Indigenous languages are spoken the most tends to be the highest places of biodiversity. So Indigenous knowledges and languages are really important in in biodiversity and in generating climate change solutions. There's something to learn from that and draw on. Unfortunately, the very same processes that seek to undermine and eradicate Indigenous autonomy and jurisdiction over lands and eradicate languages are those colonial forces, and they're still at play. So I like to think that language, living on the land, living well, taking care of the world around you, the natural world, is living well and living up to our responsibilities to the natural world and future generations. So many of you are probably aware of the International Panel on Climate Change report came out this summer, 2021, just when things were completely insane in Canada in terms of wildfires and a heat dome. And essentially what's probably one of the most frightening things about this report is that some of the changes are now irreversible. We're literally at that tipping point. What happens in the next 10 years is really going to matter in terms of the planet and future generations. The other main finding that came out of the report was that humans are the cause of all this. And so I often refer to these as the disaster reports. There's the IPBES report, the IPCC report of 2018, the 1.5 report that said the same thing. They just point to like deteriorating planetary health and call for dramatic transformation in order to move in a different direction. So I contributed to the Lancet policy brief this year, and this brief pointed out to the deaths basically that happen as a result of climate change, the forest fires, and First Nation communities are disproportionately impacted because they tend to have to be evacuated literally from their communities, and from northwestern Ontario to all the way over to Cornwall could be displaced and evacuated to those communities who are able to receive them. So it's really quite a dramatic disruption to Indigenous communities and to basically all communities. If you recall, there was periods of time over the summer when we were told, try not to breathe outside because the fire smoke was coming all the way down to southern Ontario, all the way east to Ottawa. So it's not one of those kind of issues that's happening way over there and not affecting more urban folk anymore. So the context for climate change in Canada that is starting to become more, for lack of a better word, more on the radar than it had been, is recognition of cultural genocide, that these policies, historical and ongoing, impact the well-being of Indigenous peoples. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, probably many of you are familiar with that, spoke to Canada's policies of cultural genocide. This is just a quote from the TRC that basically said a lot of these policies were there to gain control over the lands and resources of Indigenous people. So when we talk about nature-based solutions, and are those going to allow Indigenous peoples to still, or I shouldn't say allow, they already do, facilitate Indigenous peoples' authority, governance, and jurisdiction, because we know that they're effective caretakers of lands. Are those kind of policies going to continue, or practices? So this historical context has had a huge impact on Indigenous communities. Murdered, missing Indigenous women again found the same findings. So you have to acknowledge colonialism. And a lot of the circles that I'm in, people don't like to do that. They don't like that C word. They only talk about carbon, that C word. So they don't like colonialism. So a lot of the times I find in a lot of these circles, particularly more of the science-based circles, folks don't know what colonialism has to do with climate change and what that has to do with assessing vulnerability or risk to Indigenous peoples. So sometimes it's frustrating for me because I spend my time trying to explain the history of Indigenous people as opposed to contributing to the climate change discussion. I guess I am contributing to it, but not in the way that I thought when I show up to the meeting. So there's a general lack of acknowledgement, although that's slowly starting to change. Reconciliation and colonialism. So this history of colonialism has an impact. One of the main findings, maybe some of you are as old as I was back in the day when the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples report came out, and its main finding was that pretty well any colonial and then later the Canadian government's policies in relation to Indigenous peoples were wrong. They were misguided and they didn't work. The exclusion of Indigenous people continues in having a say over their lives, lands, and livelihood. And because of this, Indigenous peoples are already more vulnerable and at risk than Canadians in every area of well-being. So in climate change, when we do risk and vulnerability, Indigenous peoples are already at a huge disadvantage because of this history of colonialism. And there's this well-being index that the government of Canada uses, Indigenous Services Canada, a well-being index that they draw on the methodology used for the World Health Organization, and it points to key indicators of well-being. And you can see how Indigenous peoples are comparing to the Canadian population. So these get tracked because they're trying to close the gap. But it's left Indigenous people not in a good place to be able to adapt to and be resilient to climate change. So there's injustice and equity in terms of burdens and benefits, but I'm not going to, and climate change exacerbates these existing conditions. So this is what I find really one of the most interesting parts of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I mean, I tend to look at the world through, or my scholarship anyway, through the environment sustainability lens. So when I was reviewing the Truth and Reconciliation report, this is what jumped out at me, was that we're not really going to ever have reconciliation unless we reconcile our relationship with the natural worlds. And that was the elders and traditional knowledge holders group that spoke to this. So this is, again, starting to become part of conversations. But to me, I refer to it as earth-based reconciliation because as opposed to other kind of state ideas about reconciliation, which tend to be controversial in Indigenous communities, but this is one that I found that really spoke to me in terms of the report. And I pay a lot of attention to this because my grandmother and my mother went to residential school. So climate change and colonialism. So Indigenous peoples, as we laid out, already have inequities in Canadian society in terms of every indicator of well-being. And they're facing very serious climate change impacts. And structural inequalities that exist create even more impacts in relation to Indigenous peoples. So they become a lot more vulnerable to climate change impacts. So this is work actually that I draw on from Professor Kyle White, a Potawatomi scholar who's at now Michigan University, and he talks about how climate change, Indigenous peoples understand their vulnerability to climate change as an intensification of colonially induced environmental change. So, and I found this in my own work. So when I go into communities and we're talking about climate change, communities are already very familiar with that because Indigenous peoples have already had to deal with dramatic environmental change due to colonization. People have been relocated, buffalo were killed off, and that changed the ecosystem. So people have already had to deal with massive environmental change and due to colonial forces. And so people experience climate change in the same way. A lot of the same forces that caused the environmental change that they'd experienced for centuries is now has a different name, but it's still got the underlying root causes to it. So often that's not well understood again in the circles that I talked about that I'm in, because they want communities to differentiate between environmental and climate change. So like literally people have been told that's not climate change, that's environmental change. So there's there's this line that's drawn, and it does not make sense in the lived experience and realities of Indigenous people. So this is, I'm not going to read this. These are just climate change impacts. We just call it the HEHE report, healthy environment, healthy economy. Canada's most recent enhanced climate change policy. It's not really looking good in terms of Indigenous. They've quantified it here. So the other compounding factor here for Indigenous communities, particularly First Nations, is they're already dealing also with multiple crises. So many of you know the water crisis, food insecurity, child welfare crisis, infrastructure crisis, housing crisis. So there's these other crises that in communities are already dealing with, and then you have this on top of it all. So it's very it's a big huge stressor on Indigenous communities. So to summarize some of the challenges is environmental injustice, who benefits and who bears the brunt of resource development, resource extraction, environmental racism. The lack of transformation that's been called for some time has not happened, which is why every disaster report is painting a bleaker and bleaker picture. Ongoing colonialism, that hasn't left, lack of basic human rights in many communities, and violation of Aboriginal and treaty rights. So those are just a few of them. So the problem. So in terms of the way that I'm now thinking about a lot of this, as I try to think through, okay, which direction do we want to move in, and how can Indigenous peoples contribute to these larger processes? So you have this is what I call a tension. It's a strange kind of tension that exists in this field, and the part of it is Indigenous people have endured major environmental and one could argue climatic changes over the last 500 years in Canada, 250 or so. Yet, Indigenous peoples, particularly those where language is still spoken, caretake the most biodiverse places in the world and have knowledge that can enable a sustainable future, or at least contribute to it. So there's this strange tension. The very thing that enables you to have this knowledge and survive to the present day, land and land-based relationships, is also under threat. So sometimes I think sometimes in some of the circles that I'm in, people aren't quite sure how they're supposed to engage Indigenous people. Is it as vulnerable, marginalized people who are at risk, or people with Indigenous knowledges who can contribute to these broader processes? So there's this sort of tension people kind of navigate as part of these conversations. But what does happen, though, is that Indigenous peoples tend to be excluded from decision-making tables around climate change. And that's what I've seen in my experience. And lack of recognition of rights, UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and are often relegated to a stakeholder status. So this is this is a huge problem in Indigenous communities. So it means that you're not also part of the solutions either. You're not part of developing what might be solutions. Because what's enabled Indigenous peoples to survive, what's enabled like me to be here despite policies of cultural genocide, was actually culture, language, on the land activities. That's what built the ability to adapt and to be resilient. That's what's enabled Indigenous peoples to be able to survive and thrive into the present day. So Ariel Deranger, so she's probably on her way to COP26, is the executive director for Indigenous Climate Action. And so this is how she describes the climate crisis, that you can't address it unless you address the root causes. And she again points to those other C words people don't like to talk about in the climate change discussions. I'm not gonna read this. There's a lot of text there, I know, but recently a report came out dated 2020 And it pointed to the enormous bias in terms of who gets funding to generate climate change knowledge. And the natural and technical sciences have over 770% more funding than the social and science and the humanities. And then there's the 1,000 most influential climate scientists, of which only 22 were women, and none were identified Indigenous, and 5 were scholars from Africa. Carbon Brief did another analysis and basically said, so most of the climate change scientists are from Europe and then to the United States after. So what happens is certain kinds of questions get funded and not others. And I have to say I have found this in the work that I do in these advisory committees. So when we're presented with research that's being conducted, I find oftentimes a very Southern Ontario bias in many ways, like for health and for infrastructure. And it's because it's really limited to the data that exists. I'll say, why aren't you looking at this particular issue in the North? Because we don't have the data. Why aren't you looking at this? Like questions that I have as an Indigenous person growing up in a community and still working with Indigenous communities through Chiefs of Ontario, they can't really answer my questions because the data doesn't exist. They can really only work with the existing data. So when people weren't asking the right questions, 40 years ago, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, or questions that were going to be relevant and priority to Indigenous peoples, we don't have it. There's a huge bias in terms of the existing body of climate change, climate knowledge. So what that means in terms of assessments, when I've been involved in the assessments, we rely on the peer-reviewed literature. So when you're excluded from climate change funding and science, Indigenous peoples and others aren't going to be able to generate the kind of knowledge that's needed to be able to address the realities and priorities in Indigenous communities. We don't have the data. So I found that a huge challenge when I was contributing to these. I had this insane task of answering the question around water, vulnerability, risk, Indigenous people, traditional knowledge, and climate change. And they said, ideally, the lead author told me this was for a piece for the IPCC on water. Ideally, you have all those in the title. And I just said, a lot of that just doesn't exist because we didn't generate it over the last 10 years, and we had to cite from the last 5 years. So it was very, very hard to find that. And sort of factors that could be problems for adaptation, very hard to find that kind of information as well. It was, especially from a governance or colonization perspective, very hard to find it. And again, recently this summer, the same thing, although I think we did a lot better. We were given 2 pages to talk about impacts on Indigenous people for Mexico, Canada, and the US, and tended to be the last minute. So I was asked when a lot of the other researchers had already made their contributions, because IPCC was told they were weak in Indigenous knowledge, so they were scrambling around trying to find people to contribute that perspective. So you're included again, kind of after the fact and last minute. So this is just some information on Canada's climate change policy. So Canada did, in these policies, make commitments to work with Indigenous peoples and support Indigenous climate leadership, but it hasn't happened in practice. What I found alarming in a recent scan over the summer, and I had a student again take a look at this over the last couple of weeks, do Indigenous peoples have climate change plans or strategies or anything in place? And this was all I was able to find. That's public. The Inuit to Pirset has a strategy. They're the only ones who've got a complete strategy at this time. First Nations in British Columbia are in the process of developing a province-wide climate plan, and the Assembly of First Nations is also engaging in developing one. And those are at a certain level, but specific communities haven't seen that. So if communities don't have a plan for how to address climate change, that's a rather big problem for the people who are the most vulnerable and impacted by climate change. So this is just the Indigenous Climate Action conducted a study last spring and was released. And it was assessing these policies against the interests and priorities of Indigenous peoples. And this is just one of the points that come from their findings, that it really wasn't respectful of Indigenous peoples. In fact, provinces were actively trying to exclude them from any kind of decision-making table. So this may be a reason why we don't see the kind of plans and strategies that are needed in Indigenous communities. So what could be an approach to addressing these kind of challenges? I'm just going to take a little bit of a break here and drink some water. Indigenous climate leadership. What does that look like? You also see this in Canada's climate science plan 2050, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. This idea of Indigenous leadership and climate change. What does that look like? Like how do you go beyond the rhetoric of this that you see in policy documents to reality? And so when you're excluded from the table, when you're not part of any kind of decision making, then you find other ways of trying to have an influence through advocacy or activism or land back kind of movements. But I'm also involved with the Indigenous Climate Action to try to develop an Indigenous-led climate change policy framework for communities to be able to develop their own responses. So this is trying to move away from the analysis that pointed to critiques of federal climate change policy. You don't want to you can't just leave things there. You want to then try to move to a strength-based approach, which is, okay, what are we going to do about that then? How are we going to support communities? So Indigenous climate change leadership. So it's supporting Indigenous peoples in the kind of research and work that they would like to do that's based on their lived experience, realities, and priorities. And that's going to change. Like in a climate change priority in Walpole Island, one of the southernmost First Nation in Ontario, is going to be different than Pewanik up in the James Bay Arctic region, one of the foremost northern communities. It's not going to be the same. And so there needs to be this reflection of that reality, and just to generate climate knowledge that supports governance and a self-determined future. Because right now, and when I was talking about that data, the very biased sort of climate change knowledge, in my view, we don't have the kind of climate change knowledge that we need for generating effective solutions. I mean, the climate change knowledge is pointed to all the disaster, but it hasn't been as effective at, okay, now what do we do about that then? Like, what is this transformation going to look like? And even there's still gaps in that knowledge. Again, because of this existing bias that's been there for decades. It's not going to be undone in 2 years. It's going to take some time to start generating different kind of climate knowledge. So Indigenous climate knowledge, I'm very interested in this. This is partly what my current research is trying to get at. To me, languages is an important part of it, land and language based, just like that enabled Indigenous survival to now, those land-based activities. That's an important part into the future. Indigenous knowledges, Indigenous legal traditions, what do those look like? How are they going to contribute to developing and generating innovative solutions? And also Indigenous knowledge systems and Western knowledge systems working together, either through a two-eyed seeing approach. Now folks are talking about an ethical space approach to bringing different knowledge systems together. And again, this comes back to the first assumption that I have, where Indigenous peoples are complete societies. They want to make the best decisions they can too. So they want to make the best climate kind of decisions for their communities as well. So if that means Indigenous knowledge and Western science, then talking about Indigenous knowledge doesn't mean that Western science is being rejected. It means that it comes to then serve the needs of the community in order to be able to make the best decisions that they can make. Land-based governance. So governance was not in the radar. So this is how kind of climate assessment and then the field kind of looks like. So it's very siloed. So you have risk and vulnerability, mitigation, adaptation, monitoring, and resilience. And there's different funding for these different streams, different disciplines, different, but they're not all put together. In the Indigenous lived experience, especially on the land, they're experienced holistically. When you're on a land, you're assessing risk and vulnerability before you cross that ice, and you're going to mitigate that, and you're monitoring all the time. So on the land is a holistic kind of perspective. It's not that siloed kind of perspective. And land-based governance then becomes really important. And very rarely in the conversations, although it's starting to increase, because I'm actually doing a search on this right now, is to see what people have written about how, if there's any application of existing climate knowledge to Indigenous climate governance. Because right now, what tends to happen is Indigenous peoples are just absorbed into the fold of other people's ideas of what the solutions are. And sometimes those solutions can actually be detrimental or problematic in the Indigenous experience, because they tend to be very urban based. And so they can be hugely problematic. So again, and so Indigenous peoples find themselves in other people's climate governance, either in their plans or strategies, but they don't have their own. So that's a problem in Indigenous people's experience. The knowledge isn't mobilized to support Indigenous climate decision making and governance. So what does that look like, and how can that start to be supported? So this is the Climate Science Report. Environment Canada and Climate Change released this report in 2020. So it did acknowledge the role of Indigenous peoples. So the importance of Indigenous spaces and climate change science, mobilizing Indigenous leadership and participation in climate change science and knowledge, and then the weaving of Indigenous knowledge and Western science into implementation of strategies. I haven't seen anything concrete come from this, these statements, but at least there's recognition of the role of Indigenous people, Indigenous knowledges in contributing to and generating climate science. But I think probably one of the things that I found a little uncomfortable with this is that it's still being generated in the service of others and not for the communities itself. So that little paradigm shift hasn't happened in this work yet. So again, that's something that Indigenous people then have to advocate for. So I'm not going to read this quote, but now I'm moving into the nature-based solutions. Because from my point of view, Indigenous peoples have already had ideas about nature-based solutions, so it's not new at all. The philosophy and knowledge systems and legal systems which support harmony in living with and living well with Mother Earth. I call them earth-based solutions as opposed to nature-based solutions. And again, this is the Kimberley Declaration of 2002, 10 years after the Earth Summit, where again, recognition that the land is central to the relationship and spiritual and material well-being. So these ideas aren't new in an Indigenous way of thinking. So Indigenous earth-based knowledge very much related to the land. So this is just actually a quote that came from some of the work I did with elders, where they talked about the importance of language as a revitalization of language as a climate change strategy, because that's where a lot of the knowledge is held to live well with the earth. Again, is that data that I pointed to earlier, where Indigenous peoples are speaking the language is where there's the highest biodiversity and where they're caretaking for the land. So nature-based solutions, it's a thing now. So United Nations in Canada's program funding recently for climate change. So nature-based solutions is all the rage. And this is just some of the images around it. So it's embracing nature to mitigate and adapt to our changing climate. This is from Environment Canada's report 2021 on its strategies. And it can contribute to transformative solutions, but will it? Will it in its current iteration? So this is sort of where I am with some of this thinking around nature-based solutions, because at first, when I first heard it, I got excited because I thought it was what I understood to be, Indigenous conceptions of, climate or earth-based solutions. And then I was quite disappointed to find that it actually didn't reflect that all that well. So again, that's just what the definition of what it is, and some of what's coming from the David Suzuki Foundation about the role of nature-based solutions. The problem in some of the languages I find is it still thinks about nature as just serving of human need. They don't quite move beyond that in this ontology. So again, this is a critique of nature. I'm not going to read it to you because there's an awful lot of text there, but basically it could be actually quite detrimental and harmful to Indigenous peoples unless the rights are safeguarded, so it doesn't become a land grab for others. So some other cautions. So for many years, like the approach to the ecological crisis was the techno fix. But now the nature-based solutions is critiqued as an ecological fix, like there's a fix, as opposed to this transformation that's being called for. It could be a land grab or developments, kind of similar. People are worried about, like what happened with parks, the exclusion of Indigenous people, but it was Indigenous lands. So people are a little bit worried about that. Could be seen as mitigation to offset carbon outputs as opposed to reducing carbon. Commodifying nature, it still comes from an assumption of human nature separation, that binary. It's not a balance sheet. And I've seen this in how do you calculate nature-based solutions? And in federal policy, they talk about, I think it was planting like 2 billion trees. And I go, well, that's actually not an innovative nature-based solution because people are already planting trees. Like that's not kind of new at all, but you can count and, report this somewhere. So it's not a balance sheet. It could be a new form of colonization if Indigenous peoples are not involved and their authority and rights and jurisdiction is not recognized. And a lot of this relationship building hasn't occurred yet in the Canadian context. I look at the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as providing a guiding framework because I like the Article 25 because it speaks to responsibilities to future generations. And this reminds me again of the Pipe and the Eagle story, which is Anishinaabe intellectual traditions about how we think about the world and how we think about future generations and how to be in the world. And Canada is trying to develop legislation around this, but I guess we'll wait to see what happens. But I think of that as being, a climate change approach, but I don't know necessarily if these connections are being made where they need to be made. So the Earth's guidance. So that's how I think about nature-based solutions, is the guidance literally comes from the Earth. When you think about the Pipe and the Eagle story, that the guidance comes from, it was basically the animals and the eagle that basically saved people. And the most recent IPCC report has similar findings to the Pipe and the Eagle story, if you will, if you want to look at it that way. And that humans are the cause of climate change, but we also hold the key to changing the course of destruction that we all face. And so in these stories, humans have this incredible capacity to be brilliant, to be smart, to be innovative, to be creative, to be wonderful, to be loving, to be compassionate, all those things, but we also have the capacity to be destructive. So, what kind of forces are we going to enable in order to meet the challenges of climate change? And sometimes, and I know, it's shocking to people when I say this, maybe we're not smart enough sometimes. So maybe we do need to rely on our other relatives. We need to rely on the eagles. Because when you think about earth-based solutions or earth-based guidance, and in the stories, like everything else kind of still follows its responsibility. So the bees, the animals, butterflies, they're all doing what they should be doing. It's people who aren't doing what they should be doing. And so maybe we need to rely on those beings and entities in the world that still know how to who still know how to live up to their responsibilities in the world. So maybe we need to turn to the earth and relatives for guidance. That's how I understand, I guess you could say, in Anishinaabeg, nature-derived solution. That's where it comes from, the natural world, because we're not able to figure it out as humans. So we need to get help. Listening to the land. So some of the research that I'm doing right now is trying to develop an Indigenous climate change, a climate assessment framework based on our own conceptual frameworks of, the 4 elements and the 13 moon system. And because that was one of the ways that we understood change over time. So one of the criticisms that comes about the lack of climate knowledge in Indigenous communities is we don't have a baseline. And I say, actually, we do. We know exactly what's supposed to happen at certain times of the year based on the 13 moon system. And so when each moon comes, what's supposed to be happening during that time, there's a lot of stories about the indicators and what we should be seeing and when it's time to hunt and when it's going to be time to fish, when the water's going to break up. So we already knew all that. So then now we can document that, think about that, experience that, and kind of see, oh, okay, this is what I'm experiencing now. These are the stories of my ancestors for thousands of years of what should be happening right now. So it does help us understand climate change over time. I just have a picture of the turtle because the whole Anishinaabeg way of thinking always goes back to nature. I might add, is always goes back to the natural world. So the moon and then the turtle, because our idea of time, so you have to think about time as also being part of climate knowledge, is so on the back of the turtle, there's actually 13. And I terrorized a poor little turtle crossing the road once, and because I kind of know that, but I have a science degree, I kind of get obsessed, so I literally started to count, and the poor thing was like, what is she doing? I'm just counting. Because you have a compulsion to count when you're a scientist, or I have an undergrad in science, and then so there is 13 there. Which is the 13 moons, and then all these little parts along the outside, there's 28 of them. So the turtle, as you know, is really significant in Anishinaabe thought, also Haudenosaunee thought. And so we have a 28-day, 13 months, or 13 moon system. So a lot of our knowledge and a lot of how we think is so related to the land or nature, for lack of a better word. And you have to think about this, because I was asked this once, like, why would there be so much knowledge, nature-based knowledge or land-based knowledge in Indigenous languages? And I thought, well, my ancestors for thousands of years weren't sitting around talking about, the latest craze on Netflix or anything. Like, that's what they were talking about. They were going to have to hunt the next day or get water or travel. So you had to pay attention. This is what people talked about. So of course it's going to be reflected in the language. They weren't really worried about how well the Maple Leafs were doing. That really wasn't what they were talking about. So of course it's going to be reflected. It makes perfect sense to me in the way I think about things. So a lot of what we think and where our knowledge comes from already does come from nature and from the land. So we want to self-determine our own solutions. So this is just an image from the Elders Youth Workshop that I facilitated a few years ago. Where people, youth and elders, identified language, retention, and revitalization as a key strategy, being on the land and having that knowledge, because that's what enabled us to survive, and that's what's going to enable us to survive into the future. So it's really, really important where the earth has been harmed or water has been harmed to engage in healing, and where there isn't a connection that people have to the land, that there would be a connection, and to be able to self-determine our own solutions. I remember, in this meeting, it was really surreal. When Ontario used to have environment and climate change ministry. So they in part funded this gathering. So they had their own idea what the solutions were that they thought might be helpful for communities, and they kept trying to like push them kind of on people. And their big push was community gardens and greenhouses to address the food insecurity issues. And the pushback from communities, like, those are nice, but that's not going to deal with Indigenous or First Nation food insecurity issues, because what we want to do is be able to hunt, we want to be able to fish, but guess what? The mining company just contaminated the river where we used to get our fish. So they had there's really different ideas about what the adaptation and approaches to solutions would be for climate change based on lived experience and different values and everything. As I remember just sitting there going, like, it's like it's not happening here. Indigenous peoples need to start self-determining their own solutions for their own communities, because the other solutions aren't they don't quite make sense for Indigenous people and communities. Again, earth, language, and identity was really key. So the youth were generating a lot of this content and knowledge themselves based on their conversations with elders in their communities and elders that were present. There was probably around 80 people that were present at this gathering. So what do I see as a path forward? So there's no, as many things, there's no one answer to a lot of this, and it's going to take some time to kind of change the paradigm. So decolonizing climate change approaches and research by recognizing that Indigenous people contributed to and are impacted by climate change differently, because people are still living on the land, they experience these holistically, requires a different foundation, and recognition of UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People and human rights, and recognition of Indigenous legal orders, governance, and ethical systems. So some of my research is looking at what are those Indigenous legal traditions that can assist with, moving forward with solutions for climate justice in Indigenous communities. So I'll summarize. So some of the key messages: the importance of land and land-based activities or nature. However, these are constructed, I guess, differently in people's minds for Indigenous adaptation, resilience, and futures. Indigenous-led research and generations of solutions, hardly any of that. Like, part of our commitment over the summer, most of the people part of this writing team that we were trying to put together this very short 2 pages of what the impacts are, but about 40 pages of citations. So I was trying to find where there was actually Indigenous authors, Indigenous, and anybody who did the research. Was very hard to find, but it's starting to grow. But it looks different. So the ways that this knowledge then gets conveyed also has to be accepted. Recognition of Indigenous governance as part of climate change solutions. Again, that's not part of the conversation. It's not like risk, vulnerability, monitoring, resilience and governance like that. That really hasn't been, that's not a big funding program. Recognize justice and injustice and propose solutions. So an example of this is one of the circles I was in was one of the fellows said, well, if everybody got an electric car, we'd solve a lot of this problem. We'd solve a lot of the carbon output problem. And I said, that's not really going to work in Peawanuck or Fort Severn, because they're flying communities and dirt roads, and I don't think anybody there, one, can afford or even wants a Tesla, because it doesn't really make any sense. So these kind of solutions don't really make sense. And where a lot of energy comes from in Ontario is hydroelectric or nuclear from these other sources that are creating inequities for Indigenous peoples. There's Indigenous peoples' lands in the north that are being flooded for certain kinds of generation of electricity. So just not thinking through what, though sometimes these solutions can be problematic for Indigenous peoples. and the recognition that climate change as a continuation of environmental change as a result of colonization. So you have to get at the root cause. And when I look at some of these policies, they don't like to use what I call like the colonization word, because that's of course much challenge. That's a big challenge for people to wrap their heads around as part of a climate change conversation. So I like to leave with this image. So this is a Norvell Morrisseau painting, and everything's all connected in it. And this is part of something I learned from an artist and activist named Isaac Day. And he just said that we're all part of this grand story of the earth. We're all part of this grand story of the unfolding of the earth, of what's happening. And we have a choice of who we want to be in that story. Are we going to live up to our responsibilities and support the continuance of life, or are we not? And we're all in it, whether we're Indigenous or not. We're all part of this huge story of the earth. And we have these human choices we have to make. And I think some of those human choices have to be listening to what the non-human relatives and entities and other beings and persons have to say, because maybe we're not able to figure it out without their help. So I love this image and knowing that we're all part of this, and we all have choices about who we're going to be. So miigwech for listening, and I'm hoping this made sense. This is kind of a lot of the thinking and questions that I'm grappling with at the moment. And looking forward to a conversation. Thank you. And I think I was on time.
Yeah, you were. Thank you so much, Deborah. Yeah, it was perfectly around an hour. Yes. So now it's time for the question and answer period. So if you have a question for the speaker, we invite you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And then the question is going to be asked. So I'm going to be the person who conveyed the questions to you, Deborah. They're not, so people are not, so they remain in the audience, but we can't quite see them the way the webinar is set up anyway. But that was very interesting. And maybe before the first questions come in, I'm going to start with my own little kind of question / it was maybe more like a reflection. But one thing that I noticed in your talk is that you insist up front on the need for a transformation, right? If we want to deal with climate change, there's something that has to, it's not just adaptation, right? It's not just small changes. There has to be a transformation. And I find that this way of talking about it is, we don't find it very often, especially in the documents. Like we're talking about mitigation, a little bit of adaptation. It's often unclear what needs to be done for adaptation. Here, I don't know whether I interpret you like incorrectly, but I find maybe that this idea of transformation is going even further. I wonder whether you want to comment on that. So adaptation could be just those techno fix, really. It's just changing little things, whereas here we need something much more systemic, much bigger, actually.
It does, and believe it or not, those are coming out of the scientific assessments. So the IPCC reports, the World Water reports, the IPBES report on biodiversity and ecosystem services. So they point this horrifyingly bleak picture and then say massive transformation is required. But I think what's happened is that there's a lack of imagination about what that could look like. So it's terrifying for people. So what tends to happen is people will go to COP26 and the assessments will be there, and then there'll be intense lobbying to get nation states to try to develop policies that are, reflecting like what we know about what's happening to the planet. But often what's happening is a tweaking of the status quo. Like it's still business as usual, but kind of a tweaking of it. And all of them have said the business as usual is not working. And so I think there needs to be a bit of imagination about what transformation looks like. And again, I'm not going to romanticize here, and to some extent I'm drawing on the work of Kyle White, is that Indigenous people already had to do that. We already had to transform in order to be able to survive massive environmental, social, cultural, political, every other kind of upheaval that can happen to communities. And yeah, so this transformation is required. And sort of the annihilation and genocide that Indigenous people face, everybody's now facing. So there's something to learn from there as well. And again, a lot of that was land-based. So sometimes it's a lack of imagination because we're so entrenched in a society that operates in a certain way. It's hard for people to imagine something different, even though that's being called for. Like it says, we really have to change the direction that we're going in. Yeah.
Yeah, and so one thing that I really enjoy also from the talk is like how I think you showed it clearly, and I've read it here and there, but I don't think I've heard it as clearly as in your talk, how what happened to Indigenous people and how they've been shut down and how like the genocide and the cultural side that has happened is actually preventing us from finding solutions that so there's a discontinuity, and so the group of people who might actually help us find interesting solutions that are nature-based or earth-based have been shut down for so long, and it's like we've lost the possibility, perhaps, or not maybe the possibility, but we've lost an essential part of the puzzle. And so I thank you for showing this very well. That was great. We have a comment here. It's not a question, so I'm just going to read the comment to you.
Okay.
So the person is called, sorry if I don't pronounce your name correctly, but so it's Deviani, I think. And Deviani says, thank you for your presentation. The work you do is really important. I'm a PhD student from Brazil studying philosophy and colonialism, and I'm from a Pitaguari family. I feel that I am excluded by the language in my profession, and I often feel that there is no place for me in my profession. There are narratives about Indigenous people, and I am not invited to take part in them. I feel that the problems related to the environment are problems of colonization, especially when countries have their industrial work done elsewhere. I don't know whether you want to. That was more a comment than a question. I don't know.
Yeah, you might be. You might be really interested in the Indigenous Climate Action Decolonizing Canadian Policy report, because one of the findings too was when it becomes so technical and jargony, it excludes people. Like it completely, like people are excluded. Like, what are they talking about, right? Just like the first time I heard nature-based solutions, I went, oh, okay. Like I'm automatically thinking what I explained to you about, it's like we're going to learn and we're going to coexist with nature, but it's not. It's like nature's still a commodity. How are we going to use nature to solve problems that we're creating? How are we going to use that to mitigate? Like it wasn't, I was totally, I have to admit, disappointed in what I started to find out. And I went, that's not it at all. That's not to say you're going to throw the baby out with the bathwater, as horrible that is. Sounds like, but like there is, it's sort of like a Venn diagram. There certainly are areas, I think, where there's commonalities to kind of work from, but when you're coming from a different worldview and ontology about these kinds of questions, then then there's a lot of work to be done in terms of relationship building. But jargon and terminology is one way, another way to exclude people. And even if you are at the table, so even if you're there, it doesn't mean that you're going to have the influence and people are going to listen to you. Like I've been invited to spaces where literally I remember this man in his suit turning to me saying, I don't even know why you're here. And I went, I'm kind of wondering that myself. I was actually invited, but so people don't want to kind of hear what you have to say. Like they don't want to go there. Like when people, or initially people didn't even want to say climate justice. We only talked about climate change. If I said, well, actually there's justice and equity issues, now it's climate change. So you would get corrected. And it's like, no, and you have to spend all this time explaining to people. So there's these other ways, even if you are there, that you're excluded, which is why there's a lot of the advocacy and the land defense, and that gets criticized. I'm like, because you're shut out, you're excluded. So you have to find other ways to try to have a voice, and to try to influence processes when you're not part of the process itself, to be able to generate solutions. So no, I can imagine, and that's that's a good point, and it's consistent with a lot of my experience. They're getting better, but the language of reconciliation does help because people know they should be doing something in relation to that. They're just not entirely sure what.
Yeah.
So thank you for the comment.
And so we have here kind of a follow-up from Deviani, actually. So who says, yes, this is true. I'm Indigenous, and even though I'm in academia, there is no place for me in the discussion about myself that takes place here. So yeah. We don't have that many questions tonight.
I had a long presentation with a lot of content.
yeah, you had a lot of content. I'm so, but maybe building from your last comment, actually, where you were saying like sometimes even having the language is not enough, and even during your presentation at some point you talked about differences in knowledge systems, right? So the Western knowledge system, evidence-based, and so everything kind of has to fit on a calculation sheet. Whereas, from my understanding, the indigenous knowledge or ecological knowledge or nature knowledge is also evidence-based, but I think maybe the notion of evidence here might be different for the two knowledge systems in a sense. So it's a lot has to go through the lived experience and how it's been transmitted from people to people, and so do you? So that was a long kind of introduction, but you feel like the evidence-based, or the way actually the evidence-based policy approach, which is praised and often kind of like it's the dominant voice in a sense, is not helping Indigenous people to have a voice. So it's not helping Indigenous people to have their place at the table, because they might actually approach finding evidence or finding those nature or earth solution in the same way.
Well,
if it makes any sense.
Deanna Lewis, yeah, she'll have a comment, but I'll just respond to that, and then Deanna Lewis, I think, sent a note saying she'd like to make a comment. I think, yeah, you're right. I didn't talk a lot about Indigenous knowledge systems because I could go on about that for a very long time, but yeah, you always have to be careful of appropriation in those kind of situations. So that's another caution, right, for Indigenous people. Like, are these ideas going to get appropriated by others for whatever kind of agenda? Because there's a long history of that. But Indigenous knowledge systems, again, when you understand Indigenous peoples as complete societies and not just populations that need to be studied for whatever reason, and nations, that we also had our own knowledge systems that were part of governance and laws, our own ways of deciding who an expert was. We had our own ways of deciding, as you said, validating knowledge. So just like we're in the academy, so we have our disciplines have ways of how we, like the peer reviews, conferences, all that kind of stuff is a way to peer review, generate, validate knowledge. So Indigenous peoples had that too. The problem in the climate change sphere is they look at Indigenous knowledge systems as just being data. So a lot of the efforts are to extract this knowledge from Indigenous communities and let's put it in this predictive model. So it doesn't really recognize Indigenous knowledge systems as an actual knowledge systems as everything that anybody else's knowledge system would have. It's more about how can we extract knowledge or data from Indigenous peoples and put it into these other frameworks. It probably does make it better in my view, but but it also means it's not in the community anymore for them to be able to support their own decision making and their own processes. So it was a whole other issue that would have taken me a while to kind of explain. And there is emerging scholarship on that, so people are a bit cautious. On the one, you're saying you really need to have our knowledge because clearly you're not getting it, but it's not like willy-nilly. There's still kind of cautions and processes that need to be considered in a process like that. So I don't know, Deanne, if you wanted to have your comment, or I'm not sure how this works.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Deborah in the background is feeding me some
Oh,
questions. So we have some. Uh,
oh,
I don't see Diana's comment yet, but it's going to appear at some point on my sheet.
okay.
But so we have a question from Peter, who asked, where do you see Canada in 50 or 100 years as this process goes forward?
Oh, such an awesome question. So when I think about Canada 250, well, first of all, I hope we're here. That's probably that's the first thing. Or maybe not. Like, I mean, that's too far ahead. Hopefully, there's a future for our children and grandchildren, and that they're here and they're, enjoying some kind of quality of life. And but what I would like to see that transformation. I would like to see. I'd like to be able to see, and not only just Indigenous people learning Indigenous languages. I mean, that's going to be a priority because of forced language loss as a result of residential schools, but for other people to kind of learn this as well on the terms of Indigenous people. I think we need to have a transformed society, and I think maybe we need to start trying to educate young people to have that imagination that maybe us folks aren't, that we might be lacking, because essentially they're inheriting a big mess. And every report that comes out is pointing to this great big mess. And it's completely unfair to young people to have to inherit something like that. So maybe, so there's this conventional biodiversity move towards living with nature by 2050. That would be great. Like if we could figure out, with the help of Indigenous peoples, to how to coexist and to live with the natural world in a sustainable way. It might be possible by 250, but the thing about learning something new is you kind of have to undo some other things. Like there's going to have to be an undoing and a decolonization of other things in order to generate and create something new. I'm hoping we don't have to go through a destruction to do that. I'm hoping that we can, because we're smart and we're creative and we're innovative, like that's our gift, that we can work with the natural world, to be able to figure that out. So that's what I'm hoping. Like I'm really hoping that there's a future for children and grandchildren, and future generations. So that's kind of what I see. It's a great question. And I think I struggle day to day a lot of the times, that I forget sometimes. But those are part of what those strategies are about. The Canada 250 and the Living with Nature by 2050 as part of the Convention on Biodiversity, and they are pointing to a natural world, but hopefully not in the exploitive natural world way that still tends to be predominant. So thank you for the question. I'm going to keep thinking about that. Probably wake up at 2 a.m. and think about it some more and say, I wish I thought of that 4 hours ago.
Yeah, there's always this moment where the question keeps hunting us. So we have another question from Joy Harris this time. And Joy says, building on people's fear of the language being used around words like justice and colonization when it comes to climate change, or their investment in not admitting those are part of the issue, what ways do you suggest to make people understand that those issues need to be addressed or included? So issues about like colonization and just so, as you mentioned, often people don't want to even hear about it. So how did you actually go around that, or have you managed to go to make people understand how important that is?
I think I think people can get it conceptually once they come around to it. I don't think everybody has, but I would say for the Institute on Climate Choices, and I'm on the adaptation panel, people have listened, but they don't know what to do about it necessarily. But what they did do is support smaller projects for Indigenous-led research. So little projects to point to what it is that communities are doing. So, but actually, when it comes down to like for the big reports, we say, so why are you like looking at infrastructure that way? Like in the north, infrastructure is also for housing, for IT. Like there's so many other different forms of infrastructure that matter to Indigenous people. Then I still got the same answer of we don't have data for that. so that part is still frustrating. So I'm hoping over the next 5 to 10 years that becomes more part of research. Like even the Canada 250, like they don't like to use the word, like in the like they don't like they what the code, like what you'll see, even in the Lancet work, like it was a struggle to try to bring that forward. People will say structural and systemic inequalities. They rather say that than call it colonization, because it makes people so uncomfortable. Even though I would have thought with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where I don't think we need to avoid talking about that anymore, because it's especially this summer or this spring with the children's bodies and unmarked graves, you would think that would have been shocking enough and linked to colonization for it not to be something that wouldn't be part of these broader conversations. So it's still a struggle, but I have to say in some spaces, it's the influence, not just mine, but others like are trying to advance this, is starting to have an influence, even if other euphemisms are used to avoid. I call it the C word. The C word is just so scary for people. But there's a bit. So I would say there they did respond to that. Because the other side of it is trying to be strength based. Because in Indigenous research, that's another way. That's something we're trying to avoid. What we call okay, let's just put all Indigenous on the table for suffering and call that research. Like just bring all our suffering for everybody to examine. Like that's kind of what a lot of research is, right? And okay, let's move towards that deficit, from the deficit model to more of a strength model, and where we could go. That's why I do self-determined futures, and what are our solutions? How can we mobilize knowledge based on the experience that people already have? So it does need to be part of the conversation. Another concept that I didn't talk about that I often do is the concept of love. So in that story, the animals and the eagle does what it does for the love of people and future generations. That's the motivating, I guess, factor or consideration there. In Indigenous gatherings that I'm in, that's what people talk about. I didn't show the image of where the youth, they had love in their posters. And so we ask ourselves, does our work show love for future generations? So more of that strength-based approach. It's not, it doesn't come up in these other circles that I'm in. Nobody talks about that. Actually, I had a student go through the IPCC reports and tell me if you see love in there. Is that a motivating factor for what we do? And it's not. So there's these whole other set of values that can be brought by conversations with Indigenous people. When people do land defense, that's why they're doing it at great risk to themselves in all kinds of ways. So inroads are being made, and a lot of it is external advocacy, by organizations like Indigenous Climate Action, youth activism as well. So all these different pressures coming from different points are changing slowly the kind of conversations and dialogues that we have around climate change to make it more accessible and a lot less jargony. Which, if you look at I did this once, look at the definition of climate change, and it's like really huge, and it's like that is so inaccessible to me. And if and I encourage people to do this, if you go to the Chiefs of Ontario website, there's a 5-minute video of this gathering. Nowhere captures anything, like it doesn't capture like the knowledge that was shared there. There's a young woman named Jade Willoughby, and she talks about climate change as the earth is trying to tell us what's happening to her. And she's right. That's exactly what it is. It's another way of telling a story about the earth. So that's way more accessible than this crazy, insane definition that's about that long of what climate change is. A lot of people can't relate to that particular definition. So being able to change the dialogue, decolonize the dialogue and conversation, I think will make it accessible to a lot more people, not just Indigenous people, but people who are who want to have a say and want to have an influence and are being impacted as well. So that was a long-winded answer to that question.
but interesting. Yeah, no, it's true. It's I've read a piece recently in Aeon, and the person, I forget the name of the author, was talking about how the whole climate change situation has been is always presented from a scientific perspective, but we need to think about other narratives if we really want to reach out people. It's not just a scientific problem or a situation. It's but I don't. Let's allow other people here to talk. So we have someone called Dee who wants to ask a question about revitalization, and I think that we managed to allow Dee to have audio at least.
Oh,
So,
okay.
yeah.
Hey, where's
Deanna.
Dan?
Okay.
Hi, Deb.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. I just loved this whole evening. It was so great. And so I picked up on your the part you talk about the importance of data and how we don't have data so often in our communities. And so yesterday I was on a meeting all day with a group that I do data collection with. And we started, one of the measures that we're looking at are measures of language literacy, oral literacy, written, reading. And the findings from this group show that as Indigenous people are gaining post-secondary education, we're going back to our languages. Our literacy is improving in reading and writing. And we started to have a talk about that. And these are really strong Mi'kmaq speakers who I was meeting with. And they talk about the kind of language people are using today. So they say that people might report that they're fluent, but they're fluent in a social language. Hi, how are you? How's your day? But they're not fluent in the environmental language. And so we were talking about how our knowledge, our worldview, everything is in our language. And if we don't get back to revitalizing the older language, our language is becoming less connected. And so I was really interested in your political advocacy around climate change and language, that you just have an awareness about this like priority for us to recapture from the like how important it is to capture from the elders that language that is so strong in connection to land that we're losing.
Yeah, I agree. Like in our world, the Anishinaabe world, that's recognized. Like people who I might consider fluent speakers will say, but I don't know the old language, right? And we don't use a lot of the same words anymore because people they're not on the land in the same way. So people don't, so they don't know how to talk about that and describe that. So there has to be like the language, I think, land connection in order to be able to maintain that. Because why would you talk about that if you are whatever the word is for cell phone or bicycles and whatever else, right? So so they do talk about the old language, which those speakers are becoming fewer and fewer. So actually part of the research project that we are on right now, we're trying to revitalize that language. So the land-based language and trying to actually, so instead of just only studying it, we're actually trying to revitalize it through some of the materials that we're trying to develop through that, because those speakers are becoming fewer and fewer. So you're right, like that people recognize that in community. For us, we just call it the old niche versus what people would generally be speaking when they're visiting and such. Yeah.
Yeah, like
that's really amazing work you're doing.
Pardon me?
It's amazing work you're doing. I wish I was there.
Oh, and you know what? It was the first time that I had actually heard that discussion about when we talk about language, we think it's all inclusive, but they were saying there's differences. There's a social language, there's a cultural language. And it was the cultural language that we need to reconnect to.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's also how people understand and report on that. I think I don't remember what census it was. It said that Indigenous languages were increasingly being spoken, which was different than what a lot of other data and research is pointing to. Because people thought that when you just introduce, people introduce themselves, say their clan, they thought they were speaking fluently, and they would check that. So yeah, so there's a lot more work that needs to be done around language, but I still think it's key. Like I still really think it's like so important in especially that land-based caretaking knowledge that enables that rich biodiversity and intact ecosystems and in the world and in Canada.
Yeah. Great. That's all I had to say. Thank you.
I wish I could say it was great to see you, but I just see Deanna Lewis.
And don't put the video on because I have pins in my hair and.
Oh no, okay. It's okay. You don't have to. We'll not put you on the spot that way. It's good to hear from you.
Yes.
Thank you, Diana. That was a great question, actually. Yeah, and I think it's true also of I think that if we don't have the contact with nature, we're losing this language of the environmental fluency. We just see trees or animals instead of seeing more specific, and so understanding their place. And so, yeah, fluency in the environmental language is important for all communities, I would think. Yeah, it goes along with your earth solution, or
the earth-based solution.
The earth-based solution.
I'm terrible at presenting to kids because I'm so used to the university context. And I was asked to do one with some youth in California. Said, "What can we do?" And I'm like, "What do you tell like 12 or 13-year-olds? I don't know." And but there was 5 of us on this panel, and we all just encourage people to start connect back, start noticing things. Like you can see the moon, like start. Even in their lifetime, there will probably be, unfortunately, dramatic change because this next 10 years is really key, and is to start training people to start being able to listen to the land. And the younger ones are probably more open to that. It's probably harder for me to tell the old fuddy-duddies in my my faculties, and it's probably a lot easier to teach 11-year-olds how to do that, right? So so that connection is really important.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, it's a good idea, actually, starting with connecting with nature and getting more familiar with all the things in nature. Yeah. Well, Deborah, that was wonderful. I thank you very much for all this knowledge and all those ideas that you shared with us here. I would like to thank everyone as well for participating, for being there, for listening. I don't know if many of you have been there for the whole series, but that's the end for this year's series. There should be another one next year. And it was a great way of ending. So thanks a lot again, Deborah.
Miigwech, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for having me.